Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 7 of Rock and Sand by Archpriest Josiah Trenham. And this chapter is the Church of England. And we're going to start here with an excerpt about Henry VIII. Additionally, Pope Clement was living as a virtual prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, whose soldiers had sacked Rome. Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. Henry VIII was not going to get any clemency out of Clement VII. So Henry had his theologians write various reformers in order to obtain additional opinions. When he recognized that he would not succeed in getting the papacy to bow, he pressed the theory of absolute monarchy to extremes, and incited his parliament to declare him head of the Church of England on earth. He got his new ecclesiology and his divorce. His unsavory personal life would lead him through 6 wives, 2 of whom died at his hands. Henry's conflict with the Pope was well received, however, by certain leading churchmen, who had already been deeply influenced by Protestant ideas. Chief among these personalities was Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. Even at the time that Wolsey burned Luther's books and sought to confiscate them in England, a small group of Lutheran sympathizers were meeting at the White House Inn in Cambridge. Cambridge University produced most of England's Protestant leaders, and almost all of them were martyred for their Protestant faith. Some of these figures included classical scholar Robert Barnes, future Archbishop Cranmer, Heath, Parker, and May, and future bishops Latimer, Ridley, and Fox. The Protestant movement spread to Oxford, where the great scholar William Tyndale, a master linguist who spoke fluently in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Italian, Spanish, French, and English, fled to Germany and carried out his ambition to publish an English Bible.
Henry definitely faced some adversity, it seemed like, in his pursuit of how he saw fit, the interaction with the church. And it's interesting, I just found it really interesting how Cambridge University produced some of the most of the English Protestant leaders, and that was a cool fun fact that stood out. And the fact that they equally also got martyred for their faith.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think, Elisha, you were talking about before you started, you were highlighting how in this chapter it emphasized how this was the Reformation in England came from more the political side than the spiritual side.
Yeah, so it seemed to be dictated not from the churchmen, but the opposite direction. It had mentioned that in England's case, the politicians were leading the churchmen, not vice versa. And I think that was just giving it's a critical point of saying that the powers at hand that were leading, the culture at the time really came down from, a government kind of entity down to the churchmen, which they had conflict with Henry VIII, but they didn't have a lot of leverage on how to change that, which I think is important.
Yeah, because Henry VIII essentially created the Protestant movement in England for his own political reasons. And you see, I think it might talk in this chapter, I can't quite remember how, the Anglican Church was kind of initially like the Catholic Church, a separate Catholic Church, and it went through different theological phases. I think it had a Lutheran phase, then a Calvinist phase, and I'm not sure what happened after that. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I guess I would hit on another point that it does bring up in that section that you read, William Tyndale, and we've all kind of know a little bit about him. But it's interesting that if you trickle down a little bit more paragraphs, it talks about his intentionality on how he translated the Bible into Greek, and the words presbyter as elder rather than priest, or presbyter. And it also talks about ecclesias as congregation or community rather than church. And I think these key words were played on and intentionally translated by Tyndale so that the focus was less about governance and actually more about the spirit and community of what that actually looks like. It's not something where there's this governance power that's telling you how to live your life. Rather rather a different understanding of what the word actually does say. And it encourages people to read and dive into God's word for themselves, and not in their private life, in their private time, not just whenever they show up to church.
Yeah, I think I'll read that section here.
Mm-hmm.
Tyndale used his translation to further Protestant ideas and upset the Catholic establishment in England by translating the Greek word presbyter as elder, rather than priest or presbyter, and the word ecclesia as congregation or community rather than church. By Tyndale's crafty translation, the New Testament existed for the first time in church history without the words church or priest. Tyndale established Luther's tracts in his New Testament and separately without authorial attribution. Tyndale snuck Luther's theology even into the so-called Matthew Bible, which was issued by royal permission. Cranmer convinced Henry VIII to put this Bible in all English churches. And then in a footnote here, there's just a little interesting thing. Henry VIII was concerned by the popular enthusiasm for the Bible and convinced Parliament to order that only the upper class be allowed to read it.
It's interesting how, in many ways, we will see that though these really good writings were written with well intentions, they still end up being monitored or kind of directed towards a niche market or niche group of people, and the liberty of actually enjoying the translations or enjoying the context was in many ways, I guess, in our modern day culture, would say, to a privileged group of people, or maybe just it kind of felt very mutually exclusive.
Yeah, and it seems like how much the Catholic Church actually tried to prevent the general populace from reading the Bible. I don't know enough historically to say. I know a lot of Protestants would definitely emphasize that. There doesn't seem to be as much of a problem like with using a language like Latin. In the Orthodox Church, there's, as far as I know, always been pretty much a tradition of using the local language. So there's never really been this problem of having a mass in a language that the people couldn't understand, which I think really makes no sense to me whatsoever.
That's interesting.
There's a little footnote here talking about Thomas Cranmer, and it's a footnote here, footnote 246. This was the second rash marriage of Cranmer. His first wife, Joan, died giving birth to their first child. This second marriage required the setting aside of his priestly vow of celibacy. He showed little conscience with vows throughout his life, especially in affirming the nullity of King Henry's successive marriages. He was a true puppet, declaring that Henry's marriages to Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Anne of Cleves never existed. For England's greatest reformer, the ends often justified the means. So that's a pretty harsh assessment there from Archpriest Josiah Trenham about Thomas Cranmer.
Yeah, and I'm curious if that's an observational point of like studying his life, or maybe a reference.
Yeah, I think it's just from those things he mentioned. If there's other things that influence that, there might be that he didn't talk about. And essentially, there's different history. We're not going to get into the weeds here, but it talks about Bloody Mary, all these different things that are kind of outline the history of the church. In terms of, I think, really important points for like belief or theology or just the general thrust of this book, I think we're not going to get stuck in the weeds there. Yeah. It's just kind of general history. I think it's probably interesting, but like I said, I don't think we're going to get stuck down the weeds in that.
I think if you're diving into this book, you're going to find that it's definitely not lacking in context on different characters or historical figures, and like the author definitely is very opinionated on how they view these characters. But a lot of it's history and giving background on how things led to where we are today.
Next section here that we're going to highlight, the 42 articles were altered and published as the 39 articles, containing remarkably ambiguous statements such as that on predestination. This large umbrella approach, under which many divergences of opinion might dwell, became known as the Elizabethan Settlement. Despite the popular notion of a settlement and of English tolerance, it is a fact that England judicially executed more Roman Catholics than any other country in Europe. Hundreds of Latin priests and lay people were executed under Queen Elizabeth. The theologian par excellence of this new Anglican way, the via media, was Bishop Richard Hooker.
Interesting how they condensed the 42 into 39 articles. I'm guessing they had a lot to say.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting what they were doing there.
Mm-hmm.
I think we might move on next to the next section unless you had anything else.
No, nothing really.
So there's a section here, Orthodox Anglican Dialogue. Over the centuries, the Anglican Church has, at times, felt special closeness to Holy Orthodoxy and has even fancied it herself as the Western Orthodox Church. The great architects of English Protestantism, Thomas Cranmer, in his extensive corpus, often quoted Eastern Fathers with great fondness. In his famous preface to the Great Bible, he quoted from each of the three holy hierarchs, St. John Chrysostom, Basil the Great, and Gregory the Theologian. In the 17th century, the non-juror bishops of the Church of England entered into a formal dialogue with the Orthodox Church, and substantial theological agreement was obtained. The non-jurors, however, were deficient in faith by not accepting the teachings of the Seventh Ecumenical Council on the necessity of iconography.
So giving a little more kind of fleshing this out, there is a transition of like how theology starts to shift and change in the Orthodox Church, it looks like, on what they accept and what they find, aren't so fond of.
So, I think, unless we have anything else, I think we might move on to the next section here, if that's okay.
I'm open to that, yeah. I mean, a lot of what we're looking at right now kind of gives the background of, like, the transitions of how things have, like, grown or phased between history, so I'm good with that.
Okay. I'm going to read this whole next section here, the radical deviance of modern Anglicanism. The tendency of the Anglican Communion in the 20th century, which continues into the 21st, has not been good in any way. The history of modern Anglicanism may be summarized as an aggressive departure from traditional Christian faith and practice, and a bold disregard even for its own roots. One might note that many of the fundamental Protestant theological tenets were departures from traditional Christian faith themselves, and certainly there is an essential connection between the radicalism of the Protestant Reformation and its tenets on the one hand, and on the other, the progressive radicalization and secularization of all mainline Protestant churches in the last 100 years. However, no Protestant communion of any substantial size and cultural influence has wandered so feverishly and fervently away from traditional Christianity as the Anglican Church in England and America. The Anglican World Communion is in mega crisis. The Mother Church of England itself has become spiritually vacuous, and its constituency has dissipated. In a country that used to rule half the world, and today has some 55 million citizens, approximately 1 million self-identify as members of the Church of England, their nation's official church. The state church has lost the country. There are now more Muslims in English mosques each Friday than there are Anglicans in English churches on Sunday. The church attendance rate is about 2%. 70% of English children are born outside of wedlock. Secularism has won the day, and the country stands in radical need of re-evangelization. Such re-evangelization ought to be done by the Orthodox in England. St. Arsenios the Cappadocian beautifully wrote in the 20th century that the English will return to the Christian faith when they begin again to honor their saints. Orthodox saints fill the annals of English history and are waiting to be re-embraced by English people and to show their fellows once again the path to the kingdom of God. The Episcopal Church in America is in even worse shape than the Church in England and has virtually driven out of its fold all traditional believers. The progressive apostasy of the Anglicans in the West had several distinct turning points. The Lambeth Conference in 1930 was the first Christian body, Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant, to formally endorse artificial birth control. Its grasp of traditional marriage and sexuality has been in an out-of-control spiral ever since. In 1977, the Episcopal Church in America approved the ordination of women to the priesthood and episcopate. In 2003, the Episcopal Church in America consecrated a practicing homosexual as a bishop. The consecration of divorced and openly homosexual and non-celibate Gene Robinson as an Anglican bishop has provoked scandal and division throughout the Anglican Communion. Neither the Roman Catholic nor Orthodox churches have ever officially recognized the Anglican priesthood as authentic or apostolic, and as such have always judged the Anglican claim to apostolic succession to be spurious. The developments of the last 35 years only confirm the correctness of this judgment. Today, to be Anglican in the West means virtually nothing with regard to traditional Christian dogma. One can belong to the Episcopal Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York and see communion given to ducks. One can belong to Grace Cathedral in San Francisco and venerate the icons, in quotation marks, of Harvey Milk and Martin Luther King, which adorn two eastern end pillars. Anything goes with regard to explicit Christian faith. But to be a member of the Episcopal Church USA today means your faith is secularist, your church is radically feminist, and you endorse and support homosexuality.
Well, the author definitely had something to say.
Yeah.
And it's showing this drastic shift and change in culture. And I think it's a valid point. I think it's valid that we need to talk about the mega crisis that's happening, not only in Anglican World Communion, but also in the the Christian Church at large. So, like, when we think of cultures, and I love how they talk about England and America, the two very big populations that they're very semi-powerful, influential in education, in infrastructure, and how we politics. We're out there. We're very, very, very outspoken on how we do things. And it shows how, at one point, culture at large saw this as normal, and now less than 1%. It says, in a country, they're talking about England, in a country that used to rule half of the world, and today has some 55 million citizens, approximately 1 million self-identify as members of the Church of England, their nation's official church. That's less than 1%. I'm sure if we did the math, that's probably pretty low. But it's just interesting, and I like how it hits on this idea of secularism has creeped in. Secularism has won the day, is what the author has said, and that could be because we have this idea of choice. We can choose how we want it. We can have it our way. In both cultures, the question is are we really, if we say that we believe or we say we are something, are we actually following the maybe code of ethics behind what we say we believe, or are we creating our own morphed version of what we say we believe? These things stand out to me in this section.
Yeah, it seems like both Episcopal and Anglican churches have become liberal, and there's kind of been offshoots, I think probably because of that. I think maybe the Episcopal Church in the U.S. has been referred to as the church of the ruling class, or the church of the elite, or something like that.
That's interesting. Another interesting fact versus the colorful language that concludes this segment about the Anglicans in the West, meaning what it means, virtually nothing. The author hits on the fact that to be a member of the Episcopal Church of the USA means your faith is seculars, your church is radically feminist, and you endorse the support of homosexuality, which in turn means that the core values of the Episcopal Church, in its traditional sense, has a polar opposite viewpoint of what it's saying now. It's saying we endorse these now if you say that you're a part of this. In the modern version of this church.
Yeah. And I think I'm going to read this final section here, unless we have anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Conversions of Anglicans to Holy Orthodoxy in modern times. In this quick descent into secularism and unbelief, many believing Anglican clergy and laity have left their church either to form one of the many continuing Anglican churches in America, or in more recent days to put themselves under an Anglican bishop from Africa, where the majority of Anglicans live. These flying bishops from Africa, who do not endorse the perversions of faith and practice so common in America and England, are setting up their own churches in America in a process called the Anglican Realignment. So today there are numerous Anglican jurisdictions in America, with a grand total of maybe 2 million adherents nationally. Disaffected Anglicans, especially clergy, have also fled in large number to the Roman Catholic Church. The late Pope John Paul II set up a special order for receiving Anglican clergy, most of whom were married, and for their ordination as priests with non-parochial assignments. Disaffected Anglicans have also fled in large numbers to the Orthodox Church. It is my estimate that there is no heterodox body in America from which more Orthodox clergy have come than the Anglican Communion. The number of Orthodox priests in this country that were previously Episcopal clergy is certainly in the hundreds. In my own pastorate, my oldest convert was a faithful laywoman of the Episcopal Church, whose family had been faithful Anglicans in America going back to colonial times. At 88 years of age, she wrote a strong letter to the ruling bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States, vociferously protesting the Church's apostasy from traditional Christian faith and life, and entered into Orthodox catechism. She was received into the Orthodox Church and remained a faithful parishioner until her death 10 years later. Her grandson is an accomplished Orthodox scholar active in Orthodox theological circles in America. In 2005, in response to the reckless abandonment of the traditional Christian faith and practice and to the zealous Episcopal endorsement of immorality in our culture, the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese of North America made a formal commitment to cease all dialogue with the Episcopal Church, then withdrew from said dialogue and membership in the National Council of Churches.
It's a bold move.
And
very, very bold.
Interesting note here, I believe it's the National Council of Churches that was started by the Rockefeller banking family to support ecumenism, and is indicative of the Rockefellers' manipulation of religious things. Jay Dyer talks about that. Elisha, did you have any final thoughts?
I definitely think that in many ways people who are looking for something real and authentic and genuine in religion or faith, and they find that there are people who have kind of drifted away, they take major measures to try and bring them back home. And so it was interesting to see that they were trying to do a realignment process, in America. Though I don't know how successful it was. It just is interesting that when, things are going well and people are comfortable, it seems like there are always those selective few who kind of drift away and people become followers of something that they say they believe, but they don't really know what they believe. It's just an observation, but I learned quite a bit in this chapter.
Yeah, and like we said, we didn't get into if people want the more in-depth going through of kind of the history of the Church of England, you can do your own research. You can, buy the book, read, get more into that. But we tried to hit the highlights here for you. And I think that's it for now. I think that's it for this chapter. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to get more content like this.